Okay. So we get the show on the road.
So fine, I'll sit down.
Is he ready?
Yeah,
I'm ready.
I think so.
Okay. Well, hello everybody, and it's so awesome to see you all here for Mike Koontz's exit seminar. It's super exciting. It's amazing the rate at which he's been sort of cranking out pages in the last month or so. But he actually looks pretty cool there. Like, I don't even see any dark circles or anything. But yeah, I mean, I probably shouldn't highlight this too much, but I mean, the pace has been remarkable over the last couple of months. The acceleration of pace, but with amazing results, as you're going to see. But he's been here for a while. Not that long.
Thanks.
Oh, whoops. Sorry. If anything, it's too. Well, I really do feel like it's too short partly because, well, as I'll talk about, he, for important reasons, had to move back to his beloved Colorado, and is going to be able to start up a new job there. That's really fantastic. But because of that job, he really had to, as you probably know, he had to sort of really hit the gas on his, or just finish things really quickly. Well, as you'll see, the results are really amazing. It's amazing, and there's so much more to come, which I think is so great. So, I mean, I don't know that much about Mike's prehistory, and like realizing this as I was trying to prepare this makes me realize, like, Jesus, I wish I had actually gotten to know, more about you. And we've spent this like several years together, and yet I still feel like, so I hope there are many more opportunities for that because, but a few things about his past. He has done a lot of field work before in lots of different places, and so Hawaii was one place where he actually did some really rugged, steep, canyoneering and stuff like that. He really likes mountains and has spent a lot of time there. He spent time in Rocky Mountains doing research before coming here, and then had also been doing a master's before this, and I think that went really well, and yet he wanted to kind of leave beetles behind and come to Davis and start studying trees and forests and things like that. But somehow his interests have been kind of persistent, and the beetles sort of have followed him. And as they started accelerating the mortality rates of lots of trees in the Sierras, it sort of became like, wait, you got this study, you've got mountains, got forests, and beetles, and so how to sort of put that all together. And Mike has sort of managed to sort of stitch it together kind of amazingly well. And because he's going to tell about his research, I'm not going to tell it all, but just one little part of subplot of his research, I guess, has been this study of bark beetles, and it sort of started in the old-fashioned way with a pickup truck and some boots and a hatchet, and going out to the Forest Service land, potentially without a permit, and hatcheting into a lot of trees. And basically, this is a stand of, it's one little subset of a big plantation of pine trees. I think almost all ponderosa, right? Maybe all? A lot of ponderosa. Anyway, that were being attacked by bark beetles, and thought, well, this is cool because it's an actual active outbreak of bark beetles that you could measure the spread of them. Because there's all kinds of interesting things about the dynamics of how they spread and why that you could learn if you could actually see it happening in real time. And so he actually went out and spent a lot of time mapping this by hand. These are feet, I guess. So anyway, that's a fairly big patch of forest to walk around and then hatch it into trees to see what was killing them and to map them. But I think partly because this is slow and uncertain and you never know what's going to happen with an individual outbreak. Is it really going to give you a lot of interesting data? And partly because the Forest Service then cut down all those trees. He decided to expand the study to many sites across the Sierras. And so look at actually the ambition is kind of amazing. He's going to look at hundreds of thousands of trees across 40-ish, 30-something sites in the Sierras. So, this can't be done with boots and a hatchet. It has to be done some other way. So drones, flying robots. He just got really, he basically, came up with this idea, got the funding, bought this drone kit, put it together and tinkered with it a lot, figured out how to fly it, figured out how to process the data, and as you'll see, it's kind of remarkable what you can learn on how many trees you can look at simultaneously. Oh yeah, and this is sort of what you can produce. I stole this eye candy from him. And I thought this was an awesome idea because I thought then you can go out to these forest plots and you can kind of like press go on the drone, and then you like sit back and drink iced tea under the canopy and wait for it to come back, and then when it comes back you can like download the stuff and press go again, and it, right? So, and that's basically that's what he spent the last few years doing. No, he's actually amazingly, like totally characteristically pretty type A about like keeping track of the drone, and somebody has to have eyes on it at all times per FAA regulations. And the beautiful thing about this, from my point of view, and I think the world's point of view, is that you can create these amazing, models that give you all kinds of information about huge numbers of trees. And I know I'm talking too long, so I'll speed it up. But the beautiful thing is that he's taken the results of this and it's all in an open science framework, and you can get all of the data sets online. And so just by proximity, we happen to be the people who first can use this stuff. And it's actually spawned other research projects in our lab already that we just wouldn't have done. I mean, maybe Derek, you can argue with this, but I think I certainly would never have been able to take drones and do something else with them. I still can't, but but really, because Mike developed all of everything you need to know to take a drone and map forests. We basically said, oh, that's cool, let's do that, and did that. And so it's actually going to inform things about how Cal Fire reforests forests after severe wildfires, and I expect much, much more. And so he didn't develop or invent the drone, but I think he might be one of the people who really has taken the modern form of the UAV and turned it into an instrument that lots of people will play. But that isn't all. So like he also is really invested in and great at teaching and at trying to get all kinds of people at all levels involved in the stuff that he's excited about. And this is just a little snapshot from his website of the courses that he's developed while at UC Davis. And they're all pretty excellent. He's taught them. Other people have taken them and adapted them and used them. And again, this is like this amazing resource. So the legacy that you're leaving here is really, across all these different domains, is really amazing. Yeah, and he's just an amazing guy too, and has a really nice family, and has the job that I think is a really perfect job for him. But I think he's the perfect person. I mean, they're incredibly lucky to get him. It's going to really, they're going to do so much better when he's there. This Earth Lab in Colorado. So this I kind of think of as like Mike's signature question. Like things are going pretty bad, and you're tired, and you can't figure out what to do, and he just goes, "How can I be helpful?" And he is very helpful all the time, and he cares about the people around him and takes care of them and helps them, and it's been just amazing to have you in the lab and have some part in this amazing research that you're going to present. So, I miss you already since you moved to Colorado, but I sure hope that you won't stop coming back to Davis anytime soon. Thanks, Mike. Didn't even talk about it.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, Andrew. And thank you all very much, too, for being here. I'm really excited to be sharing with you some of the work that I've been doing over the past 4 or 5 years, some of my dissertation research. The full title of my dissertation is The Effect of Forest Structure on Yellow Pine, Mixed Conifer Resilience to Wildfire and Bark Beetle Disturbance in the Sierra Nevada, California. And I'm going to try to take the sort of zero to somewhere approach to presenting this, right? So I'm going to assume no background in any of these ideas. I'm going to try to build up the framework and the motivation for this study before kind of launching into specifically what I did. But I will say that overall, I'm generally interested in scaling questions in ecology, right? When there's ecological phenomena that occur at vastly different spatial scales from just a few meters in between individual trees, but then they result in these kind of broad scale emergent patterns across the whole forest system. And so we really need to understand both of those scales simultaneously in order to make inferences across them. So we need to understand that local scale phenomenon as well as this broad scale phenomenon too. And before I go further, I want to acknowledge that I'm presenting on unceded territory of the Patwin people, and this particular work took place on the unceded territory of a number of other Native American nations, including the Washoe, the Nisenan, the Miwok, the Paiute, the Ute, and the Mono. And I'm grateful for that opportunity to live and work in these places, and it's important to remember that specifically for forest ecology and for forest disturbance ecology, the ongoing history of these Native American tribes are intimately tied to how we are, how these disturbances play out across the landscape. Funding comes from NSF, UC Davis Graduate Group in Ecology, as well as the UC Davis Department of Plant Sciences, and then the United States Forest Service Western Wildlands Environmental Threat Assessment Center funded the drone research, and I'll have some more acknowledgements at the end. Okay, I'm really excited to share this with you, so let's set the scene. All of this work took place in California, and all of it took place in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, which is that gray polygon there in the center. And the specific forest system that we were working in was the yellow pine mixed conifer system. And this particular forest system is dominated by the yellow pines, either Jeffrey pine or ponderosa pine. And then there's a mix of other conifer species in there too, white fir, incense cedar, and sugar pine especially. And then some hardwoods mixed in, mostly black oak, in varying quantities throughout this region. And this forest is sort of the dominant forest from the low to mid elevations in the Sierra Nevada. And a key feature of this system is that it's disturbance prone. And a disturbance is an event that occurs over a relatively short period of time but that has much longer term implications for the forest system. So that's kind of our operational definition of disturbance. And in the yellow pine mixed conifer, it's wildfire and insect attacks, bark beetle attacks, that really have the biggest, most extensive impact to this system. Thousands of acres, thousands of hectares, tens of thousands of hectares every single year are impacted by this kind of disturbance. And so in this photo, we see below that road there, scorched trees from a wildfire, but then above that road, we see what's probably forest insect attack killing those trees that are now turning brown. So past disturbances are linked to future disturbances via forest structure. And by forest structure, I mean the size and the spatial distribution and the species composition of a particular forest. And so here on the top, we see sort of vertical forest structure of canopies at different heights. And on the bottom, we see horizontal forest structure, where looking from the top down, we see different grouping and gapping patterns of these trees. But then the sizes of each of those trees and which particular species they are important too. So when I say these feedbacks, I mean that disturbances change the forest structure, but then that forest structure feeds back and influences the next disturbance. And these feedbacks are mechanisms of resilience for this yellow pine mixed conifer system. And my favorite definition of resilience, because it's used a lot in the ecological literature, comes from this paper, Walker et al., 2004, where they write that the resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. And we care about understanding these resilience mechanisms because humans are interrupting these natural feedbacks between forest structure and disturbance. So on the top here, this is depicting fire suppression. We've been really good at putting out fires in the last century, which has allowed these forests to infill, to become much denser, and to change some of the forest species composition as well. And then we've also been really good at warming up the atmosphere, depicted here on the bottom. So this is the deviation from average temperature between 1960 and 1990. So that's the baseline. And then each bar represents 1 year's the temperature deviation from that. So we can see from 1850 on the left all the way to last year on the right. It's getting hotter. And in California, when these droughts are occurring coincident with these record hot temperatures, we're really exacerbating water stress on trees, making them more likely to burn, and making them more susceptible to insect attack in these really large patches of mortality. Okay, so returning to our title, we're talking about the Sierra Nevada yellow pine mixed conifer forest in California. We're saying this system is disturbance prone. It's affected by wildfires and bark beetles. There's these feedbacks between forest structure and disturbance, and forest structure is this size, spatial distribution, and species composition in the forest. And we care about understanding these feedbacks because they're what makes the forest resilient and more likely to persist in the long run. So an emerging paradigm in forest ecology is that variability in forest structure can make a forest more resilient to wildfire. And I like this Walker et al. 2004 paper and this definition of resilience because it sort of gives us a framework for operationalizing this definition and measuring it on the ground. The authors go on to sort of describe some different components of resilience, one of which is resistance, which they define as the ease or difficulty of changing the system. And so a more resistant system is ultimately more resilient. And in the context of our system, we consider a state change, the change to the system, as the deaths of overstory trees. So if it's true, if this emerging paradigm is true, that greater variability in forest structure makes a forest more resistant to wildfire, then we would expect this relationship, right? Where on the x-axis, a more variable forest is resulting in fewer dead trees, number of dead trees depicted on the y-axis. So now what we need is a way to measure forest mortality, the mortality of the overstory trees, and we need a way to measure the variability in the forest structure. And then we can test this hypothesis, right? But the challenge in doing this is that if we want to ask a fundamental question about this particular system and about whether this is fundamentally true for this system, we need to measure the whole system, right? But it's spatially vast and temporally long-lived. So this is sort of a data challenge, right? We need to understand this local measure of forest structure, but we need to measure it everywhere. So we turn to satellite imagery to overcome this hurdle, specifically from the Landsat series of satellites, which orbits the Earth and takes pictures of every point on the Earth every 16 days. It's been doing that since 1984, and each individual pixel here is 30 meters across. And we use Google Earth Engine to interact with the vast amounts of Landsat data that are publicly available. This is a USGS project. All of the data are out there and available, and this Google Earth Engine platform has sort of collated all of it, ingested all of it, and it's petabytes of information, right? Like thousands of terabytes of photographs of the Earth for this 33-year-long time series, and we want to be able to wrangle it. So folks have used satellites for decades to measure tree mortality, essentially, wildfire severity on the landscape. And the way this works is essentially by taking an image before the fire and an image after the fire, and basically taking the difference between the two of them. So here on the left, we see a pre-fire image. The top and the bottom are two different instances of different fires. So on the left is the pre-fire image. In the center here is the post-fire image, and then on the right is a sort of derived measure of wildfire severity, which we're correlating as, or which we're treating as the extent, the amount of tree mortality. So this has been done before, this notion of differencing before and after fire images. But what we've added was an ability to do this programmatically with this Google Earth Engine platform. And so in California, in the Sierra Nevada, one of the most highly studied fire-prone systems in the world, we've essentially doubled the amount of fire events for which we have fire severity data by using this approach. And importantly, we do a better job of capturing small fires in this new data set. And we're going to talk about in a little bit why small fires are fundamentally different than large fires and why it's important to capture those fires too. Oops. And so with this enhanced data set, we really capture this spatial extent of the system. So on the left are all of the different fires that we're using and getting severity measurements for. In the middle is that image that I showed you already of the yellow pine mixed conifer forest system, the extent of it. And on the right are all of the samples from this particular severity measurement that we're using in our modeling efforts. And so we're capturing this whole north-south gradient of the Sierra Nevada. And just to give you a feel for the Earth Engine platform, here's the interface. So we write JavaScript code in this code editor in order to interact with these petabytes of Landsat data. And then we visualize the results down here in the map, and we can export some of those results as well. And this platform has sort of fundamentally changed the scope of analyses that I feel like are possible. It has totally changed the way that I feel like we can address some major longstanding questions about vast forest systems. And so to try to drive that point home, I'm going to see what we can do here about running this in real time. So Google Earth Engine last fall created an ability to create a simple app to visualize your algorithms that you're writing. So that's what I have here, a rudimentary app. So this background here is the Sierra Nevada mountain range, right, that polygon. This purple bit is all of what we're considering the yellow pine mixed conifer forest. And here's the interactive part of the talk. Somebody pick a good fire year, maybe one with a prominent fire that you'd recognize on the landscape. Somewhere between 1984 and 2017. 2004? Is there a particular fire you're thinking of in 2004?
Is it power fire 2004? Am I confusing?
I'm not sure. I trust you. Okay, so click 2004. This populates this map with all of the different fires that we could go get severity measurements for. So let's zoom in. Somebody help me find the power fire. Is it north-ish?
That's right there.
That's the one? Great. So let's zoom into it. That's the perimeter. Let's click Get Severity. And it's operating. Okay, and so importantly, this isn't just displaying the data that I've already created. This is, as we speak, combing through petabytes worth of Landsat imagery, taking the pre-fire, several images, masking out clouds and snow and that sort of thing, collapsing them into a single image so that we have a single composite image of pre-fire. And then it's doing the same thing for after the fire. It goes 1 year later, takes a few different images, collapses them into a single image, a composite, does that operation, and then we output the severity right here of the power fire. So just a couple of minutes, right, to comb through petabytes worth of Landsat, publicly available Landsat imagery to get some of this information. So yeah, there's definitely a learning curve associated with it, but I highly recommend, if you're at all interested in broad-scale GIS analyses, getting into Earth Engine. All right, let's close this down. Okay, so we can match up these programmatic satellite-derived calculations of wildfire severity of this tree mortality data with measurements on the ground. So here on the x-axis, we've got ground-based measurements of wildfire severity, over 200 of them that were collected at various points after various fires where they've gone out with a field crew 1 year later and measured tree scorch height and amount of tree mortality in a variety of metrics. And then on the y-axis is our remotely sensed measure of severity. And so you can see that these fits are pretty good. And in fact, they're as good or better than the ones that have been published before for this particular system in relating remotely sensed measures of severity with ground-based measures of severity. Okay, so we can measure tree mortality from satellites, but what about this forest variability measure? So for this, we borrow a technique from computer vision called texture analysis, where we describe every pixel in an image as a summary statistic of its neighbors. And because we're interested in forest variability, we're going to use the standard deviation of values within a moving neighborhood window. And the way that it works is this. First, we take an image that represents sort of the amount of overstory forest that's present, the density of the overstory forest. This is NDVI, right, the normalized difference vegetation index. This is still derived from Landsat. So this is all looking before the fire, what were the characteristics of the forest? What was the forest variability pre-fire? So darker pixels are denser forests, correlate with denser forests, which correlates with the fuel structure on the ground too. Now we define a neighborhood window, and within that neighborhood window, we collect all of the different NDVI values for those different pixels, and then calculate the standard deviation, a measure of the breadth of that distribution of NDVI values. And then we do that for every single pixel across the image. So now this image of NDVI directly becomes an image that represents the local forest variability for each of these pixels. And so a greater value for the standard deviation of this NDVI within this moving neighborhood window correlates with greater forest variability. We're saying that that means that there's more forest variability in that local area. And here's a toy example of what this heterogeneity looks like. So both of these, comparing the top to the bottom here, both of these have the same average value, the average greenness in that neighborhood, but the bottom neighborhood is more variable, right? There's more variability in the NDVI values there. And then we compared 4 different neighborhood windows for our calculations of heterogeneity, from 1 Landsat pixel in radius all the way up to 4 Landsat pixels in radius. We used a logistic regression framework to predict the probability of high severity fire at that central pixel based on this forest variability metric, this description of the neighborhood, along with a number of other sort of usual suspects that we know influence wildfire severity, like the vegetation density, the fuel moisture in that area, an annual heat load, which is an integrated measure of the slope and the aspect and the latitude of a particular spot, as well as the topographic roughness, so sort of how much that elevation varies within that same moving neighborhood window. And so let's look at some of these usual suspects first. So the biggest influence on the probability of high severity fire in this system is the pre-fire vegetation density. So here up on the top left, we're seeing increasing pre-fire vegetation density is associated with a much greater probability of complete or nearly complete overstory mortality. The next biggest effect was fuel moisture, which has a negative relationship. As the fuel is more moist, it is less likely to burn at high severity. And then on the bottom left is this annual heat load, which also had a pretty strong effect. This is that integrated measure of slope and aspect and latitude. So essentially places in the southern latitudes that are on south-facing slopes and they're kind of steep, that are getting hit with a lot of heat throughout the day, they're also more likely to burn at high severity. And then we detected no effect of this topographic roughness. Well, let's look at this forest variability effect. So here now on the x-axis is that measure of forest variability. And on the y-axis is, again, the probability of complete or near complete tree mortality. And we see this clear negative relationship, right? Greater forest variability seems to be associated with a decreased probability of high severity fire in this system. So this hypothesis seems to check out at really broad spatial and temporal scales. This greater variability in forest structure results in fewer dead trees when a wildfire eventually hits. And this is key for this particular system because lots of high severity fire for this system makes it more likely to sort of do a state change into something that's like a shrubland or a grassland, right? So in this particular system, we're identifying this as a resilience mechanism because it's closing the other end of a feedback loop where high severity fire, too much high severity fire in these kind of contiguous patches makes that forest more likely to become something other than forest. And if we think back to these 4 different neighborhood sizes that we tested, the model using the smallest neighborhood size had the most support, right? So we think that this is a super local effect of this forest structure that's influencing the probability of high severity fire. So concluding this part here, we found that pre-fire vegetation density had the biggest effect on the probability of high severity fire, and that corroborates other studies. We found that the greater variability in forest structure reduced the probability of high severity fire, which sort of fits with this general hypothesis that we think is a fundamental resilience mechanism of this system. And that spatial variability effect seems to be most relevant at the smallest neighborhood size, at a really local level. Okay, so let's revisit why we spent all of that energy coming up with a whole new data set of wildfire severity. Remember I said that many data sets are out there that exist already for wildfire severity effects, for fire effects to the forest. And what ours does is it captures smaller fire events. And I said that there was something fundamentally different about big fires compared to small fires. So let's unpack that. So most fires in this region are managed for suppression, right? They are, the goal is to extinguish them as quickly as possible. And we're really good at that. About 97 and 99% of the fires are extinguished really early and before they get too big. So they don't have too much of an impact to the forested landscape because they don't have the size to do it. But those 1 to 3% of fires that escape these containment efforts account for like 97% of all of the area burned in this particular system. So those are the fire events. Those big ones are the ones with meaningful fire effects because they are affecting the most area. And here we're showing the different lower size thresholds for different data sets of fire. So MTBS is the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity data set. It includes all fires in the western US greater than 400 hectares. And there's about 183 fires that burned in this particular system between 1992 and 2015. But then going across to the right, these different data sets, Region 5 includes fires down to 80 hectares, and that brings us up to 335 fires. Our data set brings us up to 833 fires, to all fires greater than 4 hectares. But really, in this system, in this time period, there were 16,000 fires that burned, right? So most of these fires were super small. Most of these fires were put out. And the ability to put those fires out, the ability to extinguish them, it helps when the weather cooperates and when the fuels cooperate. And we can see a sort of clear signal amongst the management objectives for the fires in our data set. So in our particular data set, we have information about whether the fire was managed for suppression or managed for resource benefit. And a resource benefit fire is an ignition that's allowed to burn under moderate to mild weather conditions, sort of in recognition of the benefit that fire has in the landscape in the long term. And so the resource benefit or wildfire use fires, WFU, are depicted in blue, and the suppression fires are depicted in red. And we see way more small fires in the suppression data set, right? Those are being extinguished very quickly. So they don't have a chance to contribute to the fire effects in the forest. So there's this filter, right? There's some ignitions that eventually have fire effects in the forest, and some fires that don't because they were quickly put out. But why were they put out? And often that's because the weather cooperated. And so if there's a whole bunch of ignitions, and some ignitions are burning under mild conditions, and then they get extinguished quickly, they get killed quickly, then there's a shift in the distribution of burning conditions for the fires that are large and eventually have fire effects. And so we have a framework for assessing a distributional shift as a result of this kind of filter. It comes from ecology and evolutionary biology. It's phenotypic selection, right? If we treat each individual fire ignition as an individual in a population and its burning conditions are its phenotype, then we can look at the differential survivorship of these different fires to initial containment efforts as a fitness measure, right? And so we can use the mechanics, the statistical mechanics of measuring phenotypic selection to see this distributional shift. So we've subsetted everything to just the suppression fires because we're really interested in the suppression effect specifically. So there's no wildfire use fires at all here. And we said that something that survives initial containment is something that burns longer than 2 days. Whereas if we put it out within 2 days, then that's something that's been killed, right? There's no chance for it to have this wildfire impact or these fire effects on the landscape. And so what we found was that here in the top left, we're seeing that the fires that survive initial attack are burning in hotter, drier conditions. That's ERC, the energy release component, which we can think of as a measure of how hot and dry the conditions are. And then also we see this heterogeneity effect, this force variability effect too, that we just were talking about, where the fires that survive initial attack are also burning in more extreme fuel conditions. They're burning in more homogeneous fuels. So why does this matter? Well, it demonstrates this strong social element that affects fire burning conditions and eventual fire effects on the landscape. And it also suggests some caution in our interpretation of fire effects from suppression fires. These effects from suppression fires are probably more extreme than they should be because they've gone through this suppression filter beforehand. This figure here shows the percent of fires that survived initial attack based on the threshold fire size in a particular data set. So looking, most fires in, say, this MTBS data set with a 400 hectare minimum size, most of those fires had survived initial attack. So the fire effects that we see from that data set are going to be shifted from the expectation if we had let all of the ignitions burn. And it's important to note, too, that there's other constraints on fire suppression beyond these fuel and weather considerations, right? If we're thinking about downstream smoke effects or general effects to human health, and there's some other things that would keep us from allowing ignitions to burn, even if it might be ultimately beneficial for forest resilience. Okay, so let's talk about the other disturbance that affects this system, insect attacks. And this is this is another scaling problem, right? These insects are interacting with the forest across just a few meters in between individual trees. But these outbreaks or this insect activity can occur across the whole forest system, as we saw in this recent super hot drought from 2012 to 2015. And this system is the western pine beetle that attacks and kills ponderosa pine, that yellow pine that's a key forest constituent in these systems. So I'm going to introduce this local disturbance effect with the cartoon life history of the western pine beetle. So a pioneer beetle will disperse to a new tree and determine whether it's a host or not, a ponderosa pine tree or not, and determine whether it's susceptible to attack. Is it weakened enough that its defenses are low enough that it can attack and kill that tree? If it is, that beetle will release aggregation pheromones that call additional beetles into the area to overwhelm that tree's defenses in a mass attack. And I should note, too, that the successful reproduction of these beetles is contingent upon tree mortality, right? So if these beetles don't kill the tree, then they're not going to survive. They're not going to produce offspring. So once enough beetles arrive at that particular tree, they don't want any more beetles to come because then it gets too crowded and then their individual average fitness decreases. So then they start releasing anti-aggregation pheromones to push away and repel any additional conspecifics from attacking the tree. These beetles will bore into the inner bark and lay eggs, mate and then lay eggs, and they form these sort of galleries inside that are really distinctive per species, right? So the western pine beetle makes these kind of S-shaped and squiggly patterns of the galleries within the inner bark. So those beetles will develop in the tree, or sorry, the offspring will develop in the tree, and the adult beetles will typically die. But then the next generation of beetles will try to disperse to the next tree, leaving the original host tree to die. And so these beetles almost exclusively attack ponderosa pine. The western pine beetle in California, anyway, almost exclusively attacks ponderosa pine. So which tree species a particular tree is, the next tree is really important, whether it's a potential host or not. They'd also much rather attack a big tree if they can, because they represent a more nutritious resource. But those big trees are well defended, right? And so if they go to try to attack a big tree because it's more nutritious, that tree is also potentially more likely to kill it, and then it won't be able to reproduce. So there's a sort of size effect that the beetles are trying to cue into to pick just the right sized tree in order to overwhelm its defenses. And then these beetles have to fly from tree to tree, right? So it matters the distance between the trees that these beetles need to go before they can find the next suitable host. So this forest characteristic that these beetles are responding to is forest structure, right? We introduced this earlier. It's the spatial distribution of the trees, and it's the size of those trees, and it's the species of those trees, whether or not they're a potential host or not. And this figure from Young et al. 2017, this is one of my favorite papers. It represents these sort of broad-scale mortality patterns that happened in this recent hot drought from 2012 to 2015. And we can see that there's more mortality sort of in these more southern latitudes, and a key finding from this paper was that it was high-density forests coupled with hot, dry forests that really led to the greatest amount of tree mortality. So we've got this really broad-scale pattern, and we know that there's this local effect, too, that I just introduced with the cartoon life history. So this is another data acquisition problem, right? We need enough data at a local scale to understand the disturbance dynamic at that local scale. But then we also need data across these broad scale gradients to try to get a sense of how those are affecting the disturbance patterns too. So here's our approach, and starting with the broad gradients here. We installed 36 permanent vegetation monitoring plots across a 1,000 meter elevation and 350 kilometer latitudinal gradient in the Sierra Nevada. And these areas were all chosen contingent upon there being western pine beetle activity, right? So they definitely had ponderosa pine in all of these sites, and they definitely had ponderosa pine mortality associated with the western pine beetle. And this is work done by Chris Fettig and Leif Mortensen to install this vegetation monitoring network. So at each of these sites, we installed 5 tiny plots that measured the location of each tree and their species and whether it was killed or not. And then for each tree, we also cut out a little window of the bark to see what it was that killed it, using those diagnostic galleries that the beetles make. And we used drones to get our individual tree level data at each site. So at each of these 36 sites, we pre-programmed these missions for the drone to fly this lawnmower pattern back and forth over the forest. This is about 40 hectares of forest that we flew with the drone, and we're taking pictures of the forest along the way. Right, so 40 hectares, about 100 acres, and it takes about 80 or 90 minutes for the drone of flight time for the drone to be doing that whole mission. So for each of these sites, we take about 2,000 images of this 40-hectare area, and here's a small sample of actual images from a drone flight flying over a patch of dead trees. And importantly, we take these pictures with a lot of spatial overlap, right? So these transects are designed close enough such that each picture is overlapping at about 90% of spatial coverage with the picture before it, both horizontally and vertically. So we load all of these images into a software program that uses a technique called structure from motion, which is a kind of photogrammetry that infers three-dimensionality from two-dimensional images. So there's a sort of upfront cost to buying that software and loading all of your pictures in, but once you've done that, it's pretty hands-free after that point. So 2 outputs of this particular processing workflow are an orthomosaic, which is a stitched top-down view of the whole forested area where all of the spatial relationships between the object and the scene are preserved. So we can do measurements on that photograph, on that orthomosaic, rather. But in addition to that, and part of the processing of getting that stitch imagery, is that we also get this 3-dimensional reconstruction of the forest. So we get this dense point cloud, and each of those points has the red, green, and blue colors associated with it. And you've seen this already. So we start with this point cloud, and we classify which points are ground or not ground by using a cloth simulator filter. So essentially, we take that point cloud, we flip it upside down, and we pretend that we're draping a cloth over top of it. And by doing that, we capture the peaks and the valleys that are underneath the vegetation. And so that's this sort of ground, right? This is the digital terrain model representing the height of the ground above sea level. Another output of the structure from motion processing is a surface model which represents the height of the ground plus the height of the vegetation. And so you can see maybe where we're going here with this is the ground plus the elevation product minus the ground product gives us a vegetation height model, right? So this now represents the height of each individual tree above ground level. Now we have a measure, essentially, of tree size, as well as a measure of tree location. We use a couple of automated algorithms to delineate each of these tree crowns. So the original orthophoto here in this example is on the left, and then the overlay of the polygons are on the right. And then we collect all of the different pixel values from within each of these polygons from the different bands of the camera, and associate those values with that particular pixel, or with that particular tree crown. And then we can classify each of those trees as alive or dead, and then for the alive ones, we can classify it to species by matching it up with the ground data that we've been flying over. So our STEM map here looks like what's on the left, and then our classification of live dead looks like what's on the right. And then after we classify by species, we can say, is it a host or a non-host? Is it a potential host to the ponderosa pine or not? So this is the stem map, same stem map there on the left, and then whether or not it's a host tree or a non-host tree on the right. And then we take that stem map and we rasterize each of these data types. So the ground data that we worked with, each of those plots was about 400 square meters in size, and so we rasterized these to 20 meter by 20 meter pixels to better correlate the data that we're going to ultimately work with in our model with how we calibrated the information by using the on-the-ground data. So this is showing on the right the fraction of dead trees within each of those 20 meter by 20 meter pixels. Again, we use a logistic regression framework to predict the probability of a host tree surviving given a few complex forest structure variables, right? The density of hosts within that 20 meter by 20 meter pixel, the density considering all of the tree species, the average host size, the average tree size of all of the species, and then a climatic water deficit value, which we're treating as a proxy for overall tree moisture stress at each of these 36 sites. And we find that local host density is the primary driver of the probability of host tree survival. So, probability of host tree mortality. Flip it around, right? So on the x-axis here, the ponderosa pine density, the host tree, as that increases, we see a greater probability that those hosts are going to die. But what's interesting is that we see a differential response of these beetles across this climatic water deficit gradient. So in hot, dry sites, now it's the larger trees and more trees that are what's driving this host tree mortality, right? So now the beetles, whereas they weren't really responding to, on average, they're not responding to host tree size, but across this gradient of climatic water deficit, across this gradient of tree moisture stress, they are, right? At the hotter, drier sites, the bigger trees are more likely to die. And conversely, at the cooler, wetter sites, it's the smaller trees. Numerous smaller trees are what's driving the probability of host mortality. And so going back to this figure from Young et al. 2017, they looked at the density, right, within each of these pixels. But complex forest structure has more components, right? If we consider the host tree size and we consider the host tree density and we consider the sort of climatic water deficit gradient as well, then maybe we can do a better job of explaining some of these patterns of mortality. So for instance, this is what their model predicted the mortality would look like across this gradient in the Sierra Nevada. They would have predicted a lot more mortality in the northern part of the state, given how dense those forests were and how hot and dry they were. And I'm putting it out there that perhaps this can be explained by a better understanding of complex forest structure, right? If we consider the different components of forest structure, like host tree size and which species the trees are, then maybe we can do a better job of explaining these mortality patterns that we see. So the key takeaways here: we show that greater variability in forest structure reduces the probability of high severity fire, which we're treating as a resilience mechanism. We show that there's this important selection effect of fire suppression that biases the burning conditions to be more extreme for the fires that have the most impact to the landscape, for these larger fires. There's this selection bias in larger fires for more extreme burning conditions imposed by this wildfire management. And then we showed that these bark beetles are responding to different characteristics of forest structure depending on the overall hotness, dryness of a particular site. So perhaps they're sort of in these outbreak conditions in the southern part of the state, but they didn't quite reach that threshold in the northern part of the state. And overall, I sort of hope that my dissertation work here demonstrates that an understanding of the complexities of forest structure, of local forest structure, including the size and the species and the spatial distribution of trees, can generate new insights into how broader scale patterns of mortality arise during wildfire and bark beetle disturbances. That's a drone image. I think that's data. That's not even just a picture. I think that's, anyway. Yeah. thank you all so much for coming. I feel like if I did anything right in my PhD, it was picking good labs. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to work with Andrew and Malcolm and all of the labs and each of their labs, as well as some of the sort of Plant Ecologist Alliance labs throughout Davis. I want to thank the Diversity Committee. It's been just so great to work with you all to kind of affect meaningful change in this program and for ecology more broadly. Thanks to all of the folks that I learned from teaching with our Davis class and with the Carpentries. Special thanks to my committee, Andrew Latimer, Malcolm North, and Connie Millar. Thank you for giving me the sort of confidence and the free rein to try high risk, high reward kinds of ideas, and who knew how they might turn out. But I always felt comfortable operating on these steep learning curves and learning new techniques in remote sensing or geography or drones or what have you, because I knew I had good spotters. So thank you for giving me the confidence to do that. And then finally, I want to thank my favorite ecologist and favorite person, Megan Oldfather, for inspiring me to be a better ecologist and a better person every day. This is Megan tending to our solar farm to keep our drone batteries charged in the field. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Great.
So I have 2 questions, which I could just ask.
You're allowed to.
But, so to specify, when you said that the bark beetles, there's higher mortality based on the density. So if the forest is more diverse though, but still equally dense, what does that correlation look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we tested that by, in the same model, we included both the host density as well as the density of all of the tree species there. And interestingly, thank you for that question. That's a great, good lead in. So the effect of overall density was negative. It reduced the probability of host tree mortality. And we think that that's because for the same number of host trees within a particular cell, if there's more tree species that they could be landing on when they're sort of dispersing throughout the forest, and that's wrong, that imposes an energy cost to these beetles dispersing locally, right? So we think that that was kind of the mechanism underlying that host density effect, is because we actually saw the opposite effect for when there's more trees of all species there. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Ryan asked if you could repeat the questions.
Yes.
And then Malcolm gives a thumbs up and says, tell Mike that he looks great in his suit.
Thanks, Malcolm. Brian, the question before was about how does host tree density change if there's just greater density of species altogether, right? So the sort of relative effect of host tree density versus all species density. That was about right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I guess briefly, I was just wondering, so you can tell what species it is from looking at the side view, the 3D, or just from looking at the pixels up above?
From the pixels up above, and that's because we had this ground data, right? This network of plots with known species where we were on the ground and identifying them, and so we know exactly the spatial locations of those, and we flew over top of them, and so we're using the spectral signature of the pixels within each polygon as a spectral fingerprint for each tree species, right? And so we say, the ponderosa pines look a little bit like this when you're considering their red, green, blue, near infrared, and red edge reflectance. And so, then once we've trained a model that can do that for a few hand classified trees, a few 500 or so, we then use that model to predict the species, to classify the species in the rest of the image. Yeah. Hi. Thanks.
You did. So this idea of phenotypic selection on fires and fire size is fascinating, and I wonder whether there are particular inferences that we've been drawing about the impacts of fire severity, fire effects, forest structure impacts on fire. Are there particular conclusions that we've been holding on to for a fairly long time that this notion of selection might cause you to second guess or think more about.
Yeah, possibly. So the question, Brian, was about what are the implications of this phenotypic selection imposed by initial containment efforts, and it's kind of what have we known to be true that might not be true? Is that about right? Yeah. So this sort of starts to get at that. So good. You all are the best audience. Right. So to answer that question, we would require a counterfactual understanding of what those fires that we extinguished would do, right? Like if we didn't kill those fires, what would they have done? And I haven't been clever enough to find a way to think about that. So I'm looking forward to somebody doing that. But one way that we can start to think about it is by comparing the suppression fires to these wildfire use fires. And so the caveat there is that the wildfire use fires are also selected on, right? If there's a potential distribution of wildfire use candidate fires, candidate ignitions, right? And we say, oh, we're only gonna let this subset burn because they're under milder conditions, then the wildfire use fires are also undergoing this filtering effect such that their effects that we've been looking at are possibly, to the extent that wildfire use fires are beneficial, which preponderance of evidence suggests that they are, those effects might be better than what we would expect had we let all possible candidate wildfire use fires burn, right? And so I feel like to answer that question, there might be somewhere in between, right? Of thinking about these fires that have fire effects, that burn for a long time, that cover a big area, sort of splitting the difference between those two extremes of the ones that we think are burning under more extreme conditions and therefore have more severe fire effects compared to the ones that we allowed to burn because they were under milder conditions. So this sort of starts to depict that. So this is the burn duration on the x-axis, and then various sort of fire effects measurements. So first on the top left, just showing the distribution. Most of these wildfire use fires burn for a pretty long time, whereas the suppression fires, all of that density mass is bunched up to really short burn durations because we put out a lot of them very quickly. But so things like the event size, on the y-axis on the top right, the proportion of high severity on the bottom left, and the stand replacing decay coefficient, which sort of tells us about how far areas within high severity patches are from seed sources. So yeah, you see this very clear impact of the ones that were put out very quickly in the suppression, where there's this, all of this dramatic change between the ones that are suppressed quickly versus the ones that are allowed to let burn. So maybe this is a way to start thinking about how we might expect fire effects to look in the absence of that counterfactual.
As a follow-up question, does your data set allow you to actually look at some of the other, so weather conditions help determine wildfire use decisions, as does the risk aversion of the decision maker.
Yes.
Probably the location and social risk.
Absolutely.
Do you have the resolution of that data set to work with someone who might want to look at a question like that?
Not in this
I'm
data.
not going to suggest you have to do that.
Not in this data set, but I think one that I'm working on now, which looks at it's essentially a way to get fire progress maps per day. That maybe that would start to tease apart that finer resolution of how were the management decisions per day affecting the ultimate fire effects. And so bear with me for a second. Here's a thought. If we had that, right, and we then have that per day weather and per day, these are the fire effects data, and we compared wildfire use fires to suppression fires using that per day kind of framework. I mean, you might expect to pick up in the suppression fires that it's that day's fire weather or the day before's fire weather that are those are the distributions that are shifting based on these management decisions. Whereas in the wildfire use fires, maybe it's the future fire conditions, right? Where they're anticipating that, oh, tomorrow's going to be real hot. Let's put the fire in this area. Let's try to guide the fire into this area where the fuel is less extreme. And so, maybe if you had some resolution on what the next day's fire fire conditions might look like versus, that days or the previous days, you could start to tease that apart. What do you think?
I like it.
Okay. Connie.
What a nice talk, Mike. Congratulations.
Thanks, Connie.
It's been a real honor to work with you and learn a lot from you.
Likewise.
So a simple question, Mike.
Great.
More technique about the drones.
Yeah.
So this area that you're flying over was relatively low relief, the mixed-conifer forests. What if I want to go in some of those steep terrain where I work out in the Great Basin and there are cliffs off the side? Do you have to keep the drone at regular height from the ground so it would be on its flying on an angle? Within sight, so if it's in wilderness or such, well, that's another issue.
Sure.
But just the rootedness to be close to it, are there sort of physical limitations to where?
I think there are some, and so there's. Oh, right. Sorry. Repeating the question. So, are there physical limitations of the terrain that dictate whether or not drones can be a useful tool for drone ecology or for forest ecology? And I'd say yes. So we were flying with sort of a terrain awareness kind of a thing, and the relief in some of these areas was a couple 100 meters, 300 meters maybe, but never cliffs, right? So the rolling terrain it can handle pretty well. And I think as flight software improves and that sort of thing, there might be a way to look at that. But that ultimately the photogrammetry might be limited there. But you could use something like LiDAR or something like that maybe to get those kinds of effects. Yeah.
How sensitive is your forest variability measurement to the time of year that the image is taken? So presumably different. It's earlier in the season, especially in drought years, you can imagine that variability is manifesting both structural variability but also some version of stress variability. I wonder if you looked at those things at all.
Yes, and in fact, Mark Schwartz asked me this during my qualifying exam. So weird, right? Mark is mad. What's that?
One of the reviewers asked her the version of that.
Similar, yeah, right. So I designed it intentionally to capture some of that phenology, right? So we take the fire event date, the discovery date of the fire, and we look for some period of time before that point to calculate this variability metric. So we should be picking up those kinds of differences as well. And I thought of that as a feature because sort of on the ground you can see the fire effects, say on shrubs. Malcolm tells a story of the folks at Tea Kettle trying to put in a prescribed fire, and it was pretty wet, and the ceanothus had leafed out, and they're just pouring the drip torch right on top of it, and it wasn't catching, and so that's something that maybe we would want to capture by looking specifically just before the fire burned. What was the greenness condition, of that variability, right? We want to say, okay, this green ceanothus might not burn very well, but one that's less green might. But no, I haven't looked at it. But maybe that's something that we could by looking at how that variability changes throughout the year, like you suggested. Sorry, and the question, Brian, was. Thank you, Jan. You're the best. Okay. Great. Well, at 5:30, we're all going to go to 3 Mile. So y'all are welcome to come to 3 Mile at 5:30 if you'd like. Okay. Great. Thank you. Hooray! Thanks, Brian.
Was Malcolm on there too?
Yeah, Malcolm.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
That was awesome.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Fantastic talk.
Thanks, Connie.
So
Thanks so much for
exciting,
coming
yeah.
Thanks so much for everything.
One thing is,
You need to get a signature.
Thanks for reminding me. Yes, I have it downstairs. If I could do that before you, I don't know if you're able to stick around. till
I'm not gonna
after
stay,
work, but yeah. it's-
but if we can do that.
Okay, great.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Very nice.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great.
Great. Hey.
They can hear you.
Congrats! Thank you. Congrats!
So what's Earth Lab is postdoc research scientist? Is that multiple years?
Yeah.
One for sure, maybe. Funding, my, I think it's awesome.
Are you working on their variability related questions or other stuff?
Yeah, Jennifer Ball. Yeah, yeah, that's the.
Nice.
That's what I am.
It's
I can do
Dear
that.
I'm standing outside of the building.
Just here.
Malcolm says great job.
Thanks. Oh, yeah, here, one second.
How long are you talking for?
That was Mike.
Okay. May not make it this evening, but I'll shoot you a message.
Yeah, and do you get out of it much yourself?
Apparently somebody's supposed to buy you a beer.
No doubt if you're happy. It's true. Doing well. Last 2 weeks. I'm trying to figure it out.
You know Bob Westfall, Andrew Letterman.
We're here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I was.
Station or even further?
I have an acceleration.
Is that Vernon?